All right, the reproductive system. We'll go over the male reproductive system, and then we'll go over the female reproductive system. There are parts involved. They're going to make the sex cells, which are the gametes. Those cells that make the gametes are the gonads, and they're also known as the primary sex organs. So let's look at the male reproductive system first. In this slide, it shows the entire male pelvis in its entirety. On the next slide, it's going to show what the male pelvis would look like if it was cut in half. We'll start with these structures up here and work our way around in a clockwise manner. So we'll start in the upper right-hand corner. All right, the first line is pointing to a gland called the seminal vesicle. It's making seminal fluid, which is going to be a part of the semen that'll be ejaculated. So the seminal vesicle is a gland on the posterior and inferior surface of the bladder. The next line is pointing to the prostate. Prostate's only in the male reproductive system. It's producing prostatic fluid, which will also be part of semen. The next line is pointing to a duct called the ductus deferens. So ductus deferens. It's also known as the vas deferens. And this tube is going to go all the way up through the spermatic cord and in front of the pubic bone, and comes around behind the bladder, and then it empties into a duct inside of the prostate called the ejaculatory duct. So the ductus deferens is for the transport of sperm cells from the testes, which are going to be the primary sex organs, the gonads, in the male reproductive system. All right, the next line is pointing to a series of veins, and this series of veins is called the pampiniform plexus. This actually transfers heat from the testicular artery. The artery is going through the spermatic cord into the scrotum, is bringing the oxygenated blood into the epididymis and the testes, and the blood that's coming into the testicular arteries at body temperature 98.6. Well, the maximum temperature for the testes to produce the most sperm cells is about 3 degrees cooler than body temperature. So the heat of the blood that's coming in through the testicular arteries being transferred to the pampiniform plexus, and it takes that heat and takes it back, transports it back into the body, so that the blood that reaches the testes is cooler than a body temperature. All right, so the next line, it is pointing to the scrotum. The scrotum is a sac. It's a flesh sac, and it's holding the primary gonads, the testes. The scrotum actually has a wall that separates the right and left testicle. So that's the scrotum. The next line is pointing to the primary sex organ, the gonad. It's going to be the testes. The next line is pointing to a part of the penis. Then we have the shaft of the penis, and then there's the head of the penis. The head is called the glans penis. So this next line is pointing to the glans penis. The next line is pointing to a structure that's on the posterior superior side of the testes, and that's called the epididymis. That's where the sperm cells go to mature. The immature sperm cells are made in the testes inside of a tube called the seminiferous tubule. They are transported to the epididymis, where they wait to be matured. The next line is pointing to the shaft of the penis, but we're just going to go ahead and call it the penis, which is going to be the male copulatory organ. All right, so we have the seminal vesicle right here, prostate, which is right here. Ductus deferens is a tube inside of this spermatic cord, and this tube goes and is surrounded by veins, but it comes around here and then comes around here behind the bladder and goes into the ejaculatory duct inside of the prostate. And then we have the pampiniform plexus, which are these series of veins that surround the testicular artery. Then we have the scrotum, which is this fleshy sac that surrounds the testes. The testes are the primary sex organs, the gonads. Then we have the glans penis, which is right here. It's made of that corpus spongiosum tissue I mentioned in the urinary chapter. The epididymis is this structure right here. And then the penis, nobody ever misses that. It's the structure that is right here. So this is also the male pelvis, as you can tell by the penis, but it is cut in half, so we can see the structures that are inside. We're going to start with this line right here, and again we're going to move around in a clockwise fashion, but we'll start with this line. That line is pointing to the ejaculatory duct. It gathers all of the parts of semen that are going to be ejaculated. So the sperm cells will gather here, so does some seminal fluid and some prostatic fluid, and that all becomes part of semen. So that's the ejaculatory duct. The next line is pointing to the scrotum, and then the next line is pointing to the ductus deferens. The ductus deferens is also known as the vas deferens, and it's going to transport the sperm cells to the ejaculatory duct. This next line is pointing to the epididymis. The epididymis is the structure where sperm cells go to mature. The next line underneath here is pointing to the testis, one of the primary sex organs. The next line is pointing to the same thing that we labeled in the urinary system, that is the spongy urethra. Alright, and then the next line is pointing to the glans penis. So the spongy urethra goes through the glans penis, and the glans penis is made of corpus spongiosum tissue. And that's what the next line is pointing to, corpus spongiosum erectile tissue. There's one tube of corpus spongiosum erectile tissue, and the urethra goes through it, which is why it's called the spongy urethra. The next line is pointing to the corpus cavernosum. The corpus cavernosum is another type of erectile tissue. It's on the dorsal surface of the penis, and that is, there's two tubes of corpus cavernosum tissue. The next line is pointing to the series of veins called the pampiniform plexus, and then the last line is pointing to the prostate gland. Oh, that's not the last line, there's one more. So that if that's the prostate gland, then the part of the urethra that goes through it is the prostatic urethra. I'm just putting urethra, but it is the prostatic urethra. All right, let me use the pointer. So this right here is the ejaculatory duct. The scrotum is this tissue that goes all the way around the testes. This is all part of the scrotum. The ductus deferens is inside here, inside the spermatic cord. Whenever a male has a vasectomy, that's when they insert scissors behind the scrotum all the way in here, and then they clip this vas deferens. All right, then we have the epididymis. The epididymis is this structure right here, the comma-shaped structure. The testis is going to be the structure right here. The spongy urethra is right here. It does go through the entire penis, so anywhere along here pointing to it is the spongy urethra. The glans penis is going to be right here. There's two types of erectile tissue. There's corpus spongiosum, which is on either side of the urethra, and then corpus cavernosum, which is this dorsal erectile tissue right here. Pampiniform plexus is going to be this series of veins that surround the testicular artery. The prostate is this entire structure right here, and then the prostatic urethra is the first part of the urethra after the bladder. Well, obviously we're still doing the male pelvis, but this one's a little easier to see. So we're going to start labeling structures right up here and work our way around. So the first thing that we're going to label and we're pointing to is the ejaculatory duct. So I'm just going to put ED. Ejaculatory duct, that's where all of the seminal fluid and the sperm cells, the prostatic fluid gathers that becomes part of the ejaculate whenever you ejaculate the semen. The next line is pointing to the prostatic urethra. That's the urethra that's going through the prostate. The next line is the prostate. Do not mix up the words prostate and prostrate. They are two different things. Prostate is a gland, prostrate is a position. The next line is called the membranous urethra. This is the part of the urethra that goes through the pelvic floor muscles. All right, the next line is pointing to the scrotum. The next line is pointing to the testis. I'm going to go a little faster because it's just like the previous two slides. Previous three slides, I think. The next one is pointing to the spongy urethra. The next line is pointing to the glans penis. The next line is pointing to something that we haven't pointed out before. It is the foreskin. The name for the foreskin is prepuce, Prepus. CE. The prepuce is the foreskin, and it surrounds the glans penis. The prepuce is the part that is removed during a circumcision. The next line is pointing to the corpus spongiosum erectile tissue, and then this last line is pointing to the corpus cavernosum erectile tissue. All right, so we have the ejaculatory duct right here. Then we have the prostatic urethra right here. The prostate gland is all of this right here. That's all the prostate gland. The membranous urethra is right here. Scrotum is this sac right here. Testis is inside right here. The spongy urethra is right here. It does go through the entire penis. The corpus spongiosum is on either side of the spongy urethra. The glans penis is the head of the penis. The prepuce is the foreskin that surrounds the glans penis. And then again, the corpus spongiosum on either side of the, or surrounds the urethra. And then here is the corpus cavernosum erectile tissue. This is a little bit of an odd model. It looks like if you could rip the penis and the scrotum and the testes out of a cadaver, this is what it would look like. Anyway, we looked at a model that looked just like this in the urinary system. We're going to start up here in the upper right-hand corner, and we're going to work our way around clockwise. So that first line is pointing to the seminal vesicle that produces seminal fluid. It's on the posterior surface of the bladder. The next line is pointing to the prostate gland. The next line is pointing to a gland that we haven't looked at yet. It's called the bulbourethral gland. The bulbourethral gland is also called Cowper's gland. It produces a lubricating secretion. It lubricates the tip of the penis to prepare it for insertion during coitus. Or it's slightly alkaline secretion because the urine that's still in the urethra is going to be acidic, which can fry up the sperm cells. So the bulbourethral secretion will help lubricate the urethra. It lubricates the tip of the penis, and it also will buffer any acidic urine still left in the urethra. All right, the next line is pointing to the corpus cavernosum. That is the dorsal surface of erectile tissue. The next line is pointing to the testes, which are the primary gonads, the organs that are producing the sperm cells. The next line is pointing to the glans penis, but in this picture they are labeling it as the corpus spongiosum. That's going to be the erectile tissue that surrounds the urethra. The next line is pointing to the spongy urethra. The next line is pointing to the membranous urethra. That is the part of the urethra that goes through the pelvic floor muscles. The next line is pointing to the bladder. No big surprise there. And then the last thing is pointing to the last part of the ductus deferens, also known as the vas deferens, which as it goes into the ductus deferens actually goes past the seminal gland and then enters into the ejaculatory duct, which is located in the prostate. All right, so we have seminal vesicle right here, prostate gland right there, the bulbourethral gland. I'm circling it with the light. It's right there. The corpus cavernosum is all of this tissue right here. The testis is going to be inside here. The corpus spongiosum is all right here. It surrounds the urethra. The spongy urethra is going to be right here. It goes through the penis. Then we have the membranous urethra, which goes through the pelvic floor muscles. The bladder, which is right here, and then the ductus deferens, right here, also known as the vas deferens. All right, now we have finished with the male reproductive system. Let's do the female reproductive system. This is the female pelvis, and the next slide is going to show the female pelvis if it's been cut in half. So we're going to start in this line right here and work our way around clockwise, just like we've been doing all along. This top line, it is pointing to a part of a tube called the uterine tube, but this specific part is called the infundibulum. I'm just going to put infund. That is a part of the uterine tube. The uterine tube is a tube that extends away from the uterus and goes towards the ovary. It's not actually attached to the ovary per se. But there are parts of it that surround the ovary and help collect the egg after it's been ovulated. But this specific part of the uterine tube is called the infundibulum. This is the widest part of the uterine tube, and this is kind of where the egg cell hangs out for 24 to 48 hours after it's been ovulated to see if it's going to be fertilized. Whether it is fertilized or not, then it's going to travel down the uterine tube and make its way to the uterus. The next picture, and the next line, is pointing to the fimbriae. Fimbriae are like fingers, and they brush over the surface of the ovary. Whenever it is time for ovulation, the fimbriae are going to beat in sync with the heartbeat and brush over the surface of the ovary to collect the egg after it's been ovulated. The next line is actually pointing to the primary female sex organ, which is going to be the ovary. The next line is pointing to the vagina. It's part of the vaginal canal. This is the female copulatory organ that receives the erect penis. All right, the next line is pointing to some of the external genitalia on the female. They have two folds of tissue. The larger fold that covers everything on the outside is called the labia majora. They are folds of tissue that surround the entire female reproductive system. And then there are folds on the inside, and they're called labia minora. The labia minora is very vascular, so it has a pink color to it. The labia majora is not as vascular and has a flesh color to it, or the color of your skin. Then we have the next line, which is pointing to the only erectile tissue in the female reproductive system, which is going to be the clitoris. And then the next line is pointing to this organ that's folded over on top of the bladder, and that would be the uterus. The uterus is the organ that houses the fertilized egg until it develops into an embryo, which then develops into a fetus, and then it has to be able to push the fetus to the outside during childbirth. So this is the female pelvis. It's been cut in half so we can see it in a hemisection. We're going to start again in the upper right-hand corner and then work our way around. So that top right line, it is pointing to the infundibulum. But it's on the other side now because whenever we looked at the previous picture, we saw one ovary with one infundibulum of the uterine tube. Now we can see inside of it because we removed some of the structures. But this is the infundibulum of the uterine tube. The next line is pointing to the fimbriae, which are the finger-like extensions that brush over the surface of the ovary. The next line is pointing to the uterus, but is a specific part of the uterus. This is called the body, B-O-D-Y. The body. It is the body of the uterus. The next line is pointing to the ovary, which is the female gonad, the primary sex organ for females. That's where the egg cells come from. The next line is pointing to the opening to the inside of the uterus, and it's called the cervix, C-E-R-V-I-X. The cervix is where they will collect cells during a pap smear and test them to see if any of them are atypical. Atypical cervical cells could mean that there's some sort of cancer process. All right, the next line is pointing to the vagina, specifically the vaginal canal, but they're just going to call that the vagina. We have the opening to the vagina right here, and then this is the vaginal canal, and it leads up towards the cervix, and then here is the uterus. All right, the next line is pointing to the clitoris, which is the female erectile tissue. And then the next line is also pointing to the uterus, but it is a specific part of the uterus. This is pointing to the fundus of the uterus. Anytime an organ has a dome shape to it, it's called the fundus. The stomach had a fundic region or a fundus because it is the dome portion that's on top. The next line is actually pointing to the uterine tube. The uterine tube extends from the uterus towards the ovary. It's also known as the oviduct, and it's also known as the fallopian tube. All right, so we have the infundibulum, which is right here, the fimbriae, which are right here, the body of the uterus, which is right here, ovary, we can see it right there, cervix is right here. We have an external os, which is an external opening to the cervix, internal os, which is the internal opening to the cervix. Don't worry about that. Just know this as the cervix. Here's the vagina, right here. Then we have the clitoris, which is right here. The fundus of the uterus, which is right here. And then we have the uterine tube, which is right here. Still the female pelvis, and this is a different angle. We're going to start labeling structures up here in the upper right hand corner and work our way around it clockwise. So that first line in the upper right hand corner, it is pointing to the infundibulum. We can see it a little better now. The infundibulum is the widest part of the fallopian tube or oviduct or uterine tube, and that's where fertilization will most likely take place. The next line is pointing to the ovary. If you ask me, this ovary in this picture kind of looks like it's got a bunch of pearls on the outside of it, which can give that appearance of having cysts, and that usually occurs in a process called polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is something totally different. Anyway, but that is the ovary. The next line, it is pointing to the cervix, which is the opening into the uterus. The next line is pointing to the vagina. Vagina is the copulatory organ of the female reproductive system. And then we have the external genitalia. We have the labia majora, which is on the outside of the genitalia. And just inside of that is another folded tissue called the labia minora. And then the next line is pointing to the clitoris. The next line is pointing to a part of the uterus. It is the body of the uterus. The next line is pointing to the dome on top, which is the fundus of the uterus. And then the next line is pointing to the uterine tube. Anyway, uterine. All right, so that's the uterine tube. All right, so the infundibulum, it is right here. The ovary, it is right here. The cervix is going to be right here. The vagina is right here. Labia majora is on the outside, and it is right here. Labia minora is on the inside, it's right there. The clitoris is right here. The body of the uterus is right here. And then the fundus of the uterus is right here. And then the uterine tube, it is right here. Now this next slide is already labeled for you. It's not on the exam. I just wanted to point this out because it's a really good picture of the ovary, and it'll help you understand the lecture, because we're going to go over some stuff in the lecture too. This whole structure is the ovary right here. And inside the ovary, we have developing follicles. The follicles surround the egg cell, which is known as the ova. The follicular cells that surround the ova, these are the cells that make estrogen and progesterone. Now, they start out as primordial follicles, which are stem cells, basically. These primordial follicles are destined to become egg cells. Now, there's a hormone called FSH, which is follicular stimulating hormone that comes from the anterior pituitary. It targets these follicles. So once the FSH reaches the ovary, it stimulates the growth of some of these primordial follicles, and they start to develop into primary and secondary follicles. So primordial follicles, a whole group of them start to become primary follicles. They start getting bigger. They start as a group called a cohort, but as they start to mature, some of them are not going to make it. They're not going to become egg cells because they're too small. So once they start maturing, if they're not going to become the main egg cell, then they will degenerate. And, well, that's the end of that. They'll degenerate. Then they start getting larger and larger, and eventually they become secondary follicles. Again, in that cohort that started to develop, those that aren't going to become the primary or the main egg cell that's going to ovulate an egg, then they will degenerate. The secondary follicle will build up, and it builds up all kinds of fluid inside called antral fluid, and then eventually it looks like this, the Graafian follicle. It's really large, and it pushes the egg cell to the very edge. It keeps filling the Graafian follicle keeps filling with more fluid until it squishes that egg cell to the end, and eventually it erupts from the surface of the ovary, and that is ovulation. After it has ovulated the egg, the cells that are left behind look like this. They become yellow, they shrink a little bit, but these yellow cells, which are called the corpus luteum, these are the follicular cells left behind after ovulation, and the corpus luteum makes copious amounts of progesterone. And progesterone is the hormone that prepares the uterus for pregnancy. It makes the endometrial lining really thick and lush and full of glycogen, and it's the perfect environment for implantation of a fertilized egg. So this corpus luteum keeps producing progesterone. If pregnancy did not happen, then this corpus luteum will start to age and degenerate, and it becomes a piece of scar tissue called the corpus albicans. And once it becomes the corpus albicans, it stops producing progesterone. And when progesterone levels drop suddenly, then the endometrial lining starts to slough off, and then you start the menstrual cycle. However, if pregnancy did occur and implantation occurs, then a placenta is formed. And when the placenta is formed, it produces the pregnancy hormone, HCG. And HCG feeds back and targets the ovary, and it keeps the corpus luteum nice and functional for about 9 months. So for 9 months, the corpus luteum keeps producing progesterone, and progesterone will keep the uterine lining thick. And then after 9 months, that's all this corpus luteum can handle. It starts to age and degenerate anyway and turns into the corpus albicans, and then the progesterone levels drop. And when the progesterone levels drop in pregnancy after 9 months, that's when the uterine contractions occur, and then it stretches the cervix. The head of the fetus stretches the head of the fetus stretches the cervix, and that is the signal for the hypothalamus to release oxytocin from the posterior pituitary, which then travels to the uterus and creates a contraction and pushes the head further into the cervical canal, and then it keeps happening over and over again until childbirth occurs. So that is childbirth in a nutshell. All right, that's all I have for you. So you should have 5 PowerPoints and 5 PowerPoint lectures for your lab final, which will be, I think, April 28th, which is a Tuesday night. Email me if you have any questions.